The night the power died, it wasn't the city's fault or some freak lightning strike or a worn-out transformer. No, it was pettiness in its purest, most ridiculous form. Karen, armed with a pair of bolt cutters and the self-righteous fury only an HOA president can conjure, snuck across my side yard at 2 in the morning like a villain from a low-budget sitcom. In the middle of the worst heatwave our state had ever recorded, she decided that my ugly solar panels and industrial generator weren't suitable for the neighborhood's carefully curated appearance. So she cut the main line feeding my house's emergency grid and scampered off like she had just saved the world from an aesthetic crisis. The only problem was, she hadn't just cut my power, she had declared war. And I wasn't the type to lose a war, especially not to someone whose most daring life achievement involved banning inflatable Halloween decorations. Hello friends, if you new here then don't forget to hit subscribe button, and if you like then hit the like button also, and don't forget to tell me in the comments where you from watching this video. 3 hours earlier, I had been sitting in my living room, basking in the coolness of my industrial-grade AC system while the news screamed warnings about rolling blackouts. They had advised everyone to prepare to stay indoors to avoid dehydration and heat stroke. Thanks to months of prep, my home was a fortress against the heat. Solar panels lined my roof, a battery bank the size of a small car hummed quietly in my garage, and a generator stood ready to kick in at a moment's notice. I was prepared for anything, except for the neighborhood lunatic taking it upon herself to sabotage me because she didn't like the look of self-reliance. Karen had always been a nuisance. She lived 3 houses down in a 2-story colonial with plastic flamingos permanently embedded in the front yard. Despite being the self-appointed enforcer of HOA regulations, her own house was a showcase of violations no one dared to address. She hated my house because I hadn't bowed to her relentless demands to blend in. I painted my door a color she hadn't approved. I installed solar panels without asking her permission. I parked my truck, a perfectly respectable Ford F-150, on the driveway instead of hiding it in the garage. In Karen's mind, these were acts of rebellion. In my mind, they were acts of sanity. After the power cut, my house fell into darkness. The AC groaned to a halt. The ceiling fans stilled. I sat up on the couch, heart pounding, confused. I checked the main breaker panel, fine. I checked the generator relay, also fine. I pulled up the feed from my security cameras and that's when I saw it, grainy footage of Karen in flip-flops and a "Live Laugh Love" t-shirt, gleefully snipping the thick line that fed my entire system. She gave a little victory hop, waved the bolt cutters triumphantly in the air, and then disappeared into the shadows. My first instinct was to confront her. But as I stood there, sweat already starting to bead on my forehead in the rapidly heating house, a better idea formed, a colder, pettier idea. If Karen wanted a blackout, she was going to get one. But she was going to be the only one living in it. If she thought I was just going to hook my system back up and quietly fix things, she clearly didn't know who she was dealing with. By sunrise, the entire neighborhood, except for one house, would be lit up like Times Square on New Year's Eve. I wasn't just going to restore my own power, I was going to make sure every neighbor had access to it. Every neighbor except Karen. The same Karen who had spent years fining people for minor infractions like planting unauthorized tulips. The same Karen who reported my neighbor's dog for barking too cheerfully. The same Karen who once tried to have my backyard grill removed because she claimed the smell of burgers violated community air quality standards. I pulled out my backup schematics. Thanks to a few side projects, I had an entire auxiliary power network rigged up to my solar and generator system. It had been designed to power my property and possibly a few neighbors in a crisis. It wasn't hard to reroute it. A few quick adjustments, a few wireless relays, and some very careful line work later, I had enough power flowing to illuminate every house on our street, except Karen's. As the sun rose and the temperature shot up, the block came alive. Lights flickered back on, air conditioners roared back to life, garage doors hummed open as people, confused but thrilled, emerged to see what was happening. Meanwhile, Karen's house sat in oppressive, sweltering darkness. From my living room window, I watched her shuffle outside in a fraying bathrobe, carrying a flashlight, her hair frizzing with humidity. She stood on her lawn, hands on hips, surveying the glowing neighborhood with disbelief and fury. She marched down the street to complain, but no one listened. In fact, they barely looked at her, they were too busy enjoying the miracle of not melting. Children played in sprinklers. Old Mr. Jenkins from across the street set up a lawn chair and toasted me with a frosty can of soda. Neighbors who usually nodded politely now waved enthusiastically, some even calling out, "Thanks, Luke," as they mowed lawns, grilled hot dogs, and hosed down their driveways in pure air-conditioned bliss. Karen, meanwhile, sweated in her yard like a melting wax figure, dialing frantically on her cell phone, no doubt calling the HOA board she ruled with an iron fist. But the board members? They were busy sipping lemonade inside their wonderfully chilled homes, watching Karen's meltdown with undisguised amusement. I could have ended it there. I could have restored her power with a flick of a switch. But where's the fun in that? This wasn't just about electricity anymore. It was about principles. It was about survival of the least petty. It was about sending a message so clear even Karen couldn't mistake it. I wasn't just surviving the heatwave, I was thriving in it, building an empire of grateful neighbors, and Karen had made herself the pariah of the block by her own hand. And the best part? This was only the beginning. By mid-morning, the full absurdity of the situation had unfolded across the neighborhood. Everyone was too grateful to question the miracle. After all, when the temperature outside climbed to 112 degrees, and the inside of a powerless house started to feel like an oven, you didn't care if the power came from the city grid or a guy down the street. The only person not basking in the cold comfort was, of course, Karen. She stood like a furious statue on her front porch, arms crossed, a scowl carved so deep into her face it looked permanent. The sweat darkened her carefully coordinated pastel outfit as she scanned the street, looking for someone, anyone, to blame. But the street was alive in ways it hadn't been for years. Kids were riding bikes, sprinklers arced rainbows across front lawns, neighbors leaned on mailboxes with glasses of iced tea. Luke's plan was already a raging success, and best of all, it was completely legal. Luke knew the system inside and out. His backup power setup had always been technically designed to cover an extended area if necessary. He had simply expanded the connections, and crucially, it was all done on private property with the consent of each individual homeowner. He had even gotten written acknowledgments from several neighbors, who were more than happy to be part of the plan. It wasn't just clever, it was unassailable. Karen had no legal grounds to interfere, and that knowledge gnawed at her worse than the heat itself. Luke watched from his office window as Karen, red-faced and huffing, tried to flag down a city utility truck that happened to be driving through. The worker, after a brief and visibly confused conversation, shrugged and drove off, leaving Karen standing alone in the shimmering heat waves rising off the asphalt. Later that afternoon, as Luke sipped a cold soda, he saw Karen's next move. She tried to fix the problem herself. She dragged two heavy-duty orange extension cords out from her garage and started stringing them across her lawn. Her goal was painfully obvious, she was hoping to plug into her next-door neighbor's outdo outlets and siphon some of that sweet, sweet electricity. It might have worked if not for the fact that her neighbor, Mrs. Vargas, had seen the security footage Luke shared with a few trusted friends. Mrs. Vargas had been one of Karen's frequent victims, constantly fined for her grandkids leaving chalk drawings on the driveway or for her rose bushes growing an inch taller than HOA guidelines. Mrs. Vargas spotted Karen dragging the cords and stormed outside like a woman on a mission. Luke could almost hear the confrontation from down the block, words like trespassing, the police, and no free rides floated through the thick summer air. Karen yanked back her cords, stomping furiously. Luke smiled, leaning back in his chair. This was unfolding better than he had ever dared hope. As the sun sank lower in the sky, casting a molten orange glow over the neighborhood. Luke's phone buzzed with a message from his neighbor Tony. It was a picture, Karen trying to plug her cords into a public light post. The caption read, "Is this even legal? Asking for a friend." Luke chuckled and texted back, "Not even close." Within an hour, a city maintenance crew arrived and politely but firmly warned Karen to cease tampering with public utilities or face a hefty fine. She retreated to her house, furious, while Luke watched the entire event unfold like the best sitcom he had ever seen. The idea for an even bigger plan started forming in Luke's mind as he grilled some burgers on his back patio. If Karen wanted to make this about aesthetics and appearances, maybe it was time to show her what real community support looked like. He decided to organize a neighborhood energy celebration, inviting everyone over to his large backyard. His setup could easily handle a few extra coolers, some music, and a bounce house for the kids. By the next morning, flyers were printed, texts were sent, and an entire mini-festival was underway. Grills sizzled with hot dogs and burgers, ice-cold lemonade flowed like water, and a local band even agreed to come and play acoustic sets under the string lights Luke rigged up across his backyard. Meanwhile, Karen's house stood dark and silent, the only blacked-out tombstone in an otherwise vibrant and festive street. Every now and then, a neighbor would glance toward her house, chuckle, and return to the party. It wasn't spite, really, it was the satisfaction of seeing karma do its work. After years of fines, complaints, and citations for absurd reasons like garage doors open too long or wind chimes causing noise pollution, the entire street finally had something to laugh about. Midway through the party, Karen tried one more desperate move. She appeared on her porch holding a clipboard and began shouting that the party was an unauthorized gathering and demanded it be disbanded. No one paid her the slightest attention. A few neighbors even booed her half-heartedly, raising their red Solo cups in mocking toasts. Luke, noticing the spectacle, calmly walked to the edge of his driveway and called out, "Karen, you're more than welcome to join if you need some shade and lemonade. Just leave the bolt cutters at home." "Yeah," the crowd roared with laughter. Karen, humiliated beyond measure, stomped back inside, slamming the door so hard a small shower of dust fell from the roof overhang. The energy party raged on well into the evening. By nightfall, the whole block was lit up in a dazzling display of lights and happiness, a shining beacon in a dark, powerless city. Karen's windows remained black, a silent reminder of her own pettiness. Luke leaned against the fence, arms crossed, surveying the glowing scene he had created. It was perfect. This wasn't just revenge anymore, it was transformation. A neighborhood that had once tiptoed around Karen's rules was now thriving in open rebellion against her tyranny. As the first stars appeared in the velvety night sky, Luke's neighbor Tony clapped him on the back and said, "You know, man, we should have done this years ago." Luke laughed and replied, "All it took was one bolt cutter and the world's worst HOA president." The two of them stood there watching the lights twinkle, the music playing, and the joyful chaos swirling around them, while somewhere in the darkness Karen sat sweating in the silence, wondering where it had all gone wrong. Luke knew exactly where it had gone wrong. The second Karen thought cutting his power would make him powerless. Instead, it had only made him unstoppable. By the next morning, word of the power party had spread beyond the street. Pictures and short videos were flooding local community groups, showing kids sliding down makeshift water slides and neighbors clinking glasses under twinkling lights while the rest of the city wilted in the heatwave. Luke woke up to a dozen messages from people he barely knew, thanking him for saving the neighborhood. There was a sense of unity now, a bond formed through both gratitude and shared irritation toward a certain HOA tyrant. Karen, however, was a different story. She was not about to take her public humiliation lying down. Around noon, Luke spotted her pacing her front yard with a cell phone pressed tightly to her ear, her mouth moving rapidly and her free hand making sharp slicing gestures. He had no doubt who she was calling. By sunset, flyers started appearing on front doors. Luke plucked one off his own and read it, barely able to suppress his laughter. In capital letters it declared an emergency HOA meeting to discuss illegal energy distribution and unsanctioned community gatherings. Mandatory attendance, it screamed, penalties for non-compliance implied but not stated. Luke chuckled as he tucked the flyer under a magnet on his fridge. If Karen thought she could intimidate the neighborhood back into submission after everything that had happened, she was about to learn the hard way that the tide had turned. At 6 sharp, the meeting took place in Karen's driveway because her house was still a dark, airless tomb. A folding table had been set up, holding a dusty binder labeled HOA policies in crooked Sharpie lettering. Karen stood behind it, clipboard in hand, looking like a cross between a dictator and a desperate mall kiosk worker. Only about 20 people showed up, but that was more than enough. Every neighbor that appeared was either openly smirking or armed with iced drinks, standing in casual, relaxed poses that said they were here for the show. Karen launched into her speech immediately, accusing Luke of violating neighborhood codes, endangering the community by operating an unauthorized power network, and hosting an illegal gathering without a permit. Luke let her rant for a few minutes, noting the growing expressions of disbelief and annoyance spreading across the crowd. When Karen finally paused for breath, he stepped forward and calmly pulled a folder from under his arm. Inside were the signed consent forms from all the participating households, copies of city ordinances permitting private solar generation and emergency power sharing agreements, and a printed email from a city official congratulating Luke on helping to relieve pressure from the strained grid. Luke didn't say much, he didn't have to. He just passed the documents to the nearest neighbor, who read them, grinned, and handed them along like a sacred relic. Karen's face grew steadily redder with each passing minute. She sputtered, trying to argue technicalities, but no one was buying it. Mrs. Vargas, armed with a lawn chair and a megaphone she had somehow procured, finally had enough. She stood up and shouted a motion to remove Karen from her position as HOA president due to gross misconduct and endangerment of residents. The crowd erupted in cheers. Karen shrieked that it wasn't legal, that she had rights, but the neighbors ignored her. Someone pulled out a makeshift ballot box, a repurposed recycling bin, and slips of paper appeared like magic. Votes were scribbled down, folded, and dropped in with grins and the occasional theatrical wink. Luke didn't even campaign, he didn't need to. By the time the votes were counted, it was a landslide. Karen received 2 votes, and considering the dark looks she was now getting from her husband, Luke suspected even he hadn't voted for her. Luke was unanimously voted in as Emergency Utility Coordinator, a position invented on the spot but legitimized with a signed resolution by the community majority. Karen stood frozen in place. Mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, she demanded to see the documents, to have the ballots recounted, but no one listened. They were too busy high-fiving Luke and Mrs. Vargas, who was already planning the first official, freedom from HOA tyranny, cookout. The funniest part came when Karen tried to storm off dramatically, only to trip over one of her own extension cords lying tangled on the ground. She sprawled into a decorative shrub with an undignified squawk, her clipboard flying into the air like a surrender flag. The laughter that erupted wasn't cruel, it was cathartic, years of pent-up frustration finally breaking loose. Karen scrambled to her feet, dusted herself off with as much dignity as she could muster, and stomped back into her house, slamming the door so hard that her front porch light, ironically still non-functional, rattled in its fixture. Luke couldn't have scripted it better if he tried. The neighborhood didn't just tolerate the new order, they celebrated it. Plans were made almost immediately for permanent improvement. Luke offered to help set up individual solar and backup systems for any household that wanted one, at cost, no markup. Word spread quickly that it wasn't just about survival, it was about independence. Independence from the power company, independence from rolling blackouts, independence from petty tyrants who thought they could control people's lives based on how they planted their flowers. As the crowd gradually dispersed, Luke lingered, talking with Tony and Mrs. Vargas about ideas for community projects, a small community garden, a tool-sharing library, even a movie night in the park powered by solar energy. It felt good. It felt right. It felt like a neighborhood finally breathing after years of being smothered by HOA bureaucracy. Inside her dark house, Karen watched from behind her blinds, her face pale in the faint light of a battery-powered lantern. She was still there, still technically a resident, but her power, both literal and figurative, was gone. She couldn't find them. She couldn't order them around. She couldn't stop the music or the laughter or the plans that were now moving forward without her. Luke didn't gloat. He didn't need to. Karen's silence was its own kind of victory, as satisfying as the cool air now circulating freely through every home but hers. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood didn't feel like a collection of isolated houses bound by rules. It felt like a community, united by a shared memory of one glorious, ridiculous, unforgettable heatwave. The days following the mutiny felt almost surreal, like stepping into a new version of the neighborhood where people actually smiled at each other and helped without suspicion or grudges. Luke's days filled quickly with projects. He met with neighbors in their garages and on their porches, sketching out simple solar plans and offering advice on backup batteries, inverters, and load sharing. It wasn't just a power movement anymore, it was a lifestyle shift, and the community embraced it with the kind of energy that had been bottled up for years under Karen's thumb. Luke even found himself coordinating with a few local electricians who volunteered to help install safer setups for some of the older residents who couldn't do it themselves. By the end of the week, nearly half the street had some sort of basic emergency power solution, and Luke's initial makeshift grid was being transformed into something permanent and cooperative. The sense of control, of self-reliance, was infectious, and the gratitude pouring toward Luke was overwhelming but humbling. Meanwhile, Karen's world grew darker in every sense. Her house remained a blacked-out relic in a street full of light. Her attempts to rally supporters failed miserably. People she used to boss around now waved politely and kept walking, as if she were just another outdated statue no one cared to acknowledge anymore. Luke wasn't cruel about it. He didn't gloat, didn't rub salt in the wound, but he also wasn't going to step in and help someone who had brought all her misery on herself. Karen's isolation was self-inflicted, and everyone knew it. But just as Luke started to believe Karen had finally learned her lesson and would fade quietly into irrelevance, she made one last desperate move. It was a Saturday afternoon when it happened. Luke was in his driveway with Tony and a couple of other neighbors, laying out plans for a shared battery shed when Tony's phone buzzed. His eyebrows shot up as he read the text, and he immediately showed it to Luke. It was a photo of Karen, caught red-handed, talking animatedly to a scruffy-looking electrician behind her house. Zooming in revealed more: a coil of thick black cable, a power tool, and what looked suspiciously like an attempt to tap illegally into the freshly upgraded underground lines feeding the street's new grid. Luke's jaw clenched. She wasn't just trying to steal electricity, she was trying to sabotage the new system. Maybe out of spite, maybe because she couldn't stand being left out. Either way, it wasn't just petty anymore, it was criminal. Luke wasted no time. He called the police, calmly explaining the situation. Officers arrived within 15 minutes, catching Karen and her hired goon mid-operation. The poor electrician looked horrified when he realized what was happening, stammering that Karen had promised it was just a simple reconnection. The officers, however, had little patience for excuses. Tampering with private utility lines was a serious offense, especially during an ongoing heatwave emergency. Luke watched from his driveway as Karen was questioned under the bright afternoon sun. She argued, wheedled, and threw around every excuse she could invent, but the officers weren't swayed. When they placed her in the back of a patrol car, it wasn't in handcuffs, yet, but the implication was clear: she would be facing charges, and serious ones at that. The neighbors stood clustered nearby, some trying not to look too obviously thrilled, others snapping photos they would no doubt share in hushed gossip for weeks to come. But Luke wasn't done. He knew that if he didn't put a permanent end to Karen's meddling, she would find some way to crawl back. So he met with the newly formed HOA Interim Committee, a group now filled with level-headed, practical residents who had no interest in returning to the old regime of fines and fear. Together, they decided to pursue civil action against Karen for vandalism, property damage, and reckless endangerment. It wasn't just about punishment, it was about protecting the future they were building. The civil suit moved fast. Karen had already alienated any potential allies she might have had. No one showed up to defend her character. No one testified on her behalf. Evidence piled up, security footage of her cutting Luke's transformer line, witness statements about her trying to steal power, even photos from her desperate backyard scheme. Faced with overwhelming proof and mounting legal costs, Karen crumbled. To avoid an even bigger financial disaster, she agreed to a settlement that involved paying substantial damages and, perhaps most satisfying of all, selling her house to cover the cost. Watching the for sale sign go up on Karen's pristine front lawn was the final delicious nail in the coffin. Luke couldn't help but pause during one of his evening walks, standing across the street and studying the sign with quiet satisfaction. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about justice, about fairness, about seeing a bully finally have to live with the consequences of her actions. The day the moving trucks pulled up was like a holiday on the street. Neighbors gathered on lawns with cool drinks, sharing knowing glances and stifling laughter as Karen's belongings were carted out piece by piece. Karen herself stayed hidden most of the day, only appearing briefly to bark at the movers and slam the front door a few more times for good measure. No one offered to help. No one came to say goodbye. When the final box was loaded and the truck pulled away, a spontaneous cheer erupted, not loud or mocking, but relieved, like the lifting of a heavy, invisible weight. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting long golden shadows over a street finally free of the tyranny that had hung over it for too long. Luke spent that evening on his porch, sipping a cold beer, watching kids play tag under the solar-powered streetlights they had installed themselves. A breeze stirred the warm air, carrying with it the scent of freshly cut grass and barbecue. It was perfect. He thought back to the night Karen had cut his power, how petty and spiteful it had seemed, how she had thought she could bring him down with one mean-spirited act. In the end, all she had done was hand him the opportunity to transform the neighborhood, to turn frustration into freedom. Tony wandered over and dropped into the chair next to him, handing him another beer. They clinked their bottles together without a word, sharing the simple, profound satisfaction of a battle well fought and well won. The block glowed gently around them, homes full of light, laughter, and life, while somewhere far away Karen fumed alone in a new, much smaller, much darker place. It wasn't the way Luke had ever envisioned things unfolding, it was better, far better. And deep down, he knew it was only the beginning of even greater things to come. The first weekend after Karen's final departure felt like a celebration of a new era. The entire neighborhood was practically humming with energy, and not just from the solar systems that now powered almost every home. It was something deeper, something more human. People who had once hurried from their cars to their front doors now lingered outside, chatting by mailboxes and setting up lawn chairs under the shade of young trees. Children roamed freely, laughter echoing down the street without anyone barking at them about noise ordinances or unauthorized sidewalk chalk. It was a neighborhood finally breathing, finally living without the invisible chain around its neck. Luke walked the block with a quiet pride, watching the small signs of real community spring up everywhere he turned. A pair of teenagers organized a Saturday lemonade stand at the corner, using power from one of the backup stations to keep their drinks cold. Mrs. Vargas proudly displayed a new flower bed that would have earned her a citation under Karen's reign, but now won universal admiration. Even Tony, who had spent years quietly grumbling about HOA pettiness, had finally installed the porch swing his wife had wanted since they moved in, painting it a vibrant blue just because he could. The transformation was almost too perfect, but Luke knew there was one final piece to complete the circle. The emergency solar project had started out as a temporary patch during a crisis, but now it needed to become permanent infrastructure. Luke spent a few late nights at his kitchen table drafting plans for a community solar array that could stand the test of time. He proposed building a tall, efficient solar tower right in the center of the neighborhood's little community park, outfitted with panels that could supply backup power to the entire block indefinitely. The idea wasn't just about power anymore, it was about independence, about resilience, about never again being at the mercy of a petty tyrant or a fragile city grid. When Luke presented the idea at the first official community meeting, held in the park under battery-powered string lights and an enormous borrowed tent, the response was overwhelming: unanimous approval, voluntary donations, and a group of eager volunteers ready to make it happen. Construction started within the week. The tower rose steadily over the green expanse of the park, an elegant structure of steel and gleaming glass that seemed to catch the light even on cloudy days. Children rode their bikes around the construction site, watching the progress with wide-eyed curiosity. Elderly neighbors brought coolers of water and sandwiches to the workers. Every nail hammered, every panel bolted in place was a testament to what could be achieved when people stopped living in fear and started building together. By the time the tower was completed, it stood like a symbol of everything they had fought for, an unshakable reminder that this was now their neighborhood, built on cooperation, trust, and a shared determination to never go back. Luke insisted that the unveiling be a simple, heartfelt event: no politicians, no reporters, just neighbors gathering to mark the occasion. On the evening of the ceremony, the entire block turned out, filling the park with folding chairs, picnic blankets, and tables loaded with homemade food. Tony, acting as unofficial master of ceremonies, handed Luke a small plaque covered in brown paper. Luke peeled it back to reveal the words etched in shining brass: "Light wins over pettiness, in memory of the great Karen blackout." The crowd erupted into laughter and cheers, clapping and whistling as Luke lifted the plaque high above his head before fastening it to the base of the solar tower. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, Luke flipped the main breaker with a theatrical flourish. Instantly, the entire park lit up. Pathways glowed softly with solar lamps, the playground shimmered under gentle spotlights, and the string lights overhead twinkled like stars. The kids squealed in delight, racing toward the illuminated playground equipment, while the adults simply stood in awe, soaking in the beauty of a night that didn't depend on anyone's permission to shine. Luke wandered through the park with a permanent grin etched onto his face, exchanging hugs, handshakes, and backslaps with neighbors who had once barely exchanged nods. Later that night, after the crowds had thinned and the laughter had faded into comfortable silence, Luke stood alone by the tower, looking up at the lights still gleaming in the warm summer air. It was quiet, peaceful, the way he had always imagined a real neighborhood should feel. He thought briefly of Karen, wherever she was now. He pictured her sitting alone in a cramped apartment somewhere, flicking a light switch that stubbornly refused to work, dreaming up petty rules no one would ever again be forced to follow. He didn't hate her. He didn't even feel anger anymore. Karen had been a symptom, not the cause. The real enemy had been fear, apathy, and resignation. And those enemies had been defeated far more thoroughly than Karen herself ever could have been. Tony wandered up, sipping a bottle of water and looking just as content. For a few moments, they stood in companionable silence, watching the lights dance across the park. Finally, Tony spoke. "You know, it's funny," he said. "If she hadn't cut your power, none of this would have ever happened." Luke smiled, feeling the truth of it settle deep in his chest. Sometimes it takes a little darkness to make you build your own light. They clinked their bottles together once more, a quiet toast to resilience, to unity, to stubborn hope. As Luke walked back home under the gentle glow of the solar lamps, he realized that what they had built was bigger than just a grid, or a park, or a tower. They had built a community that could weather any storm, outshine any blackout, and outlast any petty tyrant. The lights weren't just electric, they were symbolic. A declaration that this was a place where kindness outshined cruelty, where laughter drowned out anger, where people took care of each other not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The future looked bright, literally and figuratively, and Luke knew he would never again take that light for granted. Whatever came next, this street, this community, would stand strong, illuminated not just by solar panels but by the best parts of human nature. It had started with one act of sabotage and ended with a legacy of light. And that, Luke thought with a deep sense of peace, was the best revenge of all.